Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, we have a very special guest. He comes to us from the UK. He and I talked back in October 2019 about his podcast about a book. Again, his name is Howard Sounes. Last name is spelled Sounes. But we talked about a podcast he did titled Unheard, the Fred and Rose West Tapes. That was back October 2019, based upon his book about a very grisly serial killing story titled Fred and Rose, the full story of Fred and Rose West and the Gloucester House of Horrors. And that's a very highly sold book, very best-selling book. But Mr. Sounes has also written other books. He's a very prolific writer. Other than the book we're going to talk today, which is Bukowski, Locked in the Arms of a Crazy Life. It was originally published 1998. There's a new edition, 2017. And this book has received 89 five-star reviews in the U.S., so it's very well received. But some of his other titles are The Wicked Game, Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, Tiger Woods and the Business of Modern Golf, also Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney, Down the Highway, The Life of Bob Dylan, and 27, A History of the 27 Club, through the lives of Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse. That was published in 2013. And also 70s, The Sights and Sounds and Ideas of a Brilliant Decade, and The Life of Lou Reed, Notes from the Velvet Underground. So some very interesting books there. But again, this book we're going to talk about is Bukowski, Locked in the Arms of a Crazy Life. And so, Howard Sounes, are you there?
Yeah, hi, William.
Awesome. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. Great to talk with you again. It's been a while. Can you talk kind of about, you have a very long resume of books. Can you talk about where your interest in Charles Bukowski began and how the genesis of this book, Bukowski, Locked in the Arms of a Crazy Life?
Yes, it was my second book after the murder book, which you referred to, Fred and Rose. And I didn't want to, my first book was a bestseller, but I didn't want to spend the rest of my life writing about crime. And my interests really were more cultural. And so I thought it'd be nice to write a very different type of book. And I wanted to write a biography. And I wanted to write about someone whose work I admired. And at the time I was reading Charles Bukowski. I was reading his novel Post Office, which is the first of his 6 novels. And it's about a guy working for the US Postal Service in California and hating his job. And it's a very funny novel. It's only a short book. It's about 100 pages long. And I really enjoyed it. And Bukowski writes about himself in his books. And I thought, this is an interesting guy. This is a good subject for a biography. And it would be a nice change from writing about murder.
Right.
This seems like a very interesting, warm character. And so that was what became my second book.
Gotcha. And he passed away in 1994. This was originally published in 1998, and you talked to a lot of the people around him. Can you maybe give the audience, for people in the States who may not know as much about Bukowski, can you give a brief biography of his background, where he was from, and how he came to Los Angeles and really started his career?
Yeah, so he was born in 1920, and he died in 1974 at the age of, 1994 at the age of 73. He was born in Germany. His mother was German. His father was a US serviceman stationed in Germany after the First World War. He came to back to the US with his parents, who got married out there when he was about 3. And he grew up in Los Angeles and spent basically his whole life in the Los Angeles area. He had a very unhappy childhood. He really hated his father, who was a cruel, sadistic sort of man. And as a teenager, Bukowski had a terrible, disfiguring case of acne, which really ruined his life as a young boy. And it made him very introverted.
They even called it acne vulgaris, right? Like something very extreme.
Yeah. So he had this really disfiguring. He had to go to hospital to have this extreme treatment for this terrible acne, which obviously was exceedingly embarrassing for a teenage boy who was already pretty unhappy and a bit of an insular, lonely character. And this really marked his character. So Bukowski, at the time of the Depression, in fact, was this disfigured, unhappy boy. And then he essentially fell out with his father. He started to drink. He became very interested in literature. He was a voracious reader, and he left home to live the life of almost a hobo, traveling, but mostly living in cheap rooming houses in Los Angeles and in different parts of America, in Philadelphia, and drinking and kind of writing poetry and not being very engaged in the world, sort of living as a sort of loner. And this was the experience which he later drew on when he became quite a famous writer in his middle life.
Right, and so he even traveled to New York City and kind of bounced around a lot of places, right? But he was still always interested in literature. You write that he was in, like, I think he was in libraries in LA and spending time reading and writing there, right?
Yeah, so he's a voracious reader, and he loves Dostoevsky. He admired Celine, the French writer, Hemingway, all sorts of people. John Fante, who's now a fairly obscure American writer, but he was mostly writing poetry. He wanted to be a poet originally, and so he was writing sort of avant-garde verse, living in rooms in Philadelphia, drinking, hanging out in bars, and working. The important thing is he was also working factory jobs, manual jobs, which he really hated. He really resented. Giving his time over to bosses in exchange for pay. And he was constantly being fired, and they were ridiculous jobs. I mean, one of the jobs was that he worked in a dog biscuit factory. There were jobs like that. And
right, pickle factory, I think, was one.
Yeah, and he was always falling out with the boss and being fired for being a completely, useless employee, really. Didn't show up on time, really resented it, wanted to get to leave as soon as possible, wasting time. But he felt that his time was really precious, and that bosses were just using him and exploiting him, which of course they were. So he took a kind of intellectual view of it. So he's actually really an intellectual writer, but he's also a working class, as we would say, a blue collar. He's really a blue collar person, but he's also very, very intellectual and very cultured.
Yeah, it's really a remarkable distinction of his personality, coming up really a laborer, blue collar, but also having literary aspirations for a long period of time. And then so he's bouncing around. He comes back to Los Angeles, and I guess he infamously just started working for the post office, right? That was kind of one of his longest stretch of employment, correct?
Yeah, so one of these many jobs, he would call them shit jobs. I mean, that was one of his quotes, was working as a postman, delivering the post. That didn't last very long. He was, of course, chased by dogs and things like that, and he hated it. And so he became a postal clerk in the great big downtown Los Angeles U.S. postal sorting office, which was a massive building. Last time I was there, it was still there, near the railway station, downtown LA. And he worked there for quite a number of years on the night shift, just sorting mail manually by putting letters into cubby holes, really, doing it very, very fast on the night shift. And that was his longest job. And at the time he lived in Hollywood, but he didn't live in the Hollywood which we all think of. He lived in the cheap part of Hollywood, in between West Hollywood and downtown LA. If you know LA, he lived in a place called East Hollywood, around Sunset and Western, right, which was rough. And up until recently, it was still rough and poor, really. And he would live in a cheap room there, or a cheap apartment. He would drive an old car, cheap old car. He would drive to work in the evening in downtown LA, do his terrible job, come home, drink a lot to sort of cope with this miserable life he led, and then write poetry. And that was his life until he was about 50 years old.
Right, like he was kind of unknown really for that time, writing away, underground, had kind of a interesting relationship with women, like married, divorced, new woman, I mean, can you talk about his relationships with females up until he was around 50?
Yeah, because of his acne vulgaris, he had very little luck with women as a young person, as you can imagine. When he became this kind of bum in his 20s and 30s, living rough in LA and Philadelphia and New York and places, he met a woman, an alcoholic called Jane Cooney Baker, who they became barflies. And of course, there's a film about Bukowski called Barfly, and it's based upon his relationship with this woman called Jane Cooney Baker, who was from New Mexico. She was a drunk, he was a drunk, and they lived, essentially, they drank, they just drank together. But they were also lovers, and it was a kind of common law marriage. She drank herself to death. So that was really the great love of his life. And he wrote a wonderful, wonderful book of love poems about Jane, with a terrific title, which the rock band U2 later used, called "The Days Run Away Like Wild Horses Over the Hills." Fantastic book, brilliant title. And she died. She drank herself to death. So that was a tragedy, which he never forgot. He married a woman who had a physical deformity from Texas called Barbara Fry. She had something wrong with her neck, which made her look like a dwarf, or she was somehow, she had a sort of strange physical appearance. And that was a disastrous marriage that went wrong. He spent most of his time on his own until he became a published writer in his sort of late middle age, and he started to become well known. And he started to get a cult following in LA, where he wrote a column for the LA Free Press called Notes of a Dirty Old Man, which was kind of like a funny column about, being a drunk and sort of a sarcastic, but amusing column. It got a following. He started to give public readings. He wrote that first book, Post Office, about being a postal clerk, which turned out to be the first of 6 novels. And they became increasingly well known and published, indeed, all over the world. And he went from being a kind of a bum to being quite famous, actually, and quite well off. Bought himself a Mercedes-Benz, became friends with Sean Penn and Dennis Hopper and Madonna and all sorts of famous people who really liked his work, Bono and people like that. And, was invited onto chat shows, although he never went on them. And they made a film about his life. And all of this coincided with women taking an interest in him. And for the first time in his life, as he says in one of his poems, for a guy who didn't get laid for the first 40 years of his life, suddenly, I was getting lots of action, and he kept his phone number listed in the LA white pages just so women could easily find him and ring him up and say, "I love your work, Mr. Bukowski. Can I come round and see you?" And he would say, "Sure, come round. I'm here.
Right.
Bring some beer. We'll have a party." And then he had this sort of weird period of being a Lothario in his middle age, and he wrote a great book about it. Really funny book called Women, Just Women, which is basically about a middle-aged guy getting laid a lot for the first time in his life. And it's more or less all true, because I found all these women for my biography and interviewed them all. And that was one of the great joys of writing the book, actually.
And what kind of observations and things did they say about him when he was kind of in his kind of golden years?
Well, he was lovable, and they all kind of loved him, really. He was very wise. Of course, he was an older sort of a man, but he was also rather damaged by his life. So, of course, he was an alcoholic, and he was rather bitter, and he could be unpleasant. He could lose his temper. He could become very jealous of young girlfriends if he thought they were looking at other men. And he could in fact be violent. He could throw things, and he could, cause a scene. And he had some tempestuous relationships, and most famously with a woman called Linda King, who's a sculptress, and she was a barmaid in LA. And she was a fiery character, and Bukowski was a fiery character, and she was much younger than him. And if he saw her looking at another guy, or if he even thought another guy was looking at her, he might start causing a scene, and that might end up with a fight and broken windows and maybe a night in the police cells. But they loved each other as well. So and he wrote about this in this wonderful book called Women, where he changes the names of all the women, but one can easily identify them and find them. And so Linda King, this woman I just described, becomes a woman called Lydia. But when I met Linda, she told me that it was more or less all true, and a lot more besides.
Right. So he was had this kind of activity when he was 40. I mean, I think he also always was interesting. He probably could go to a bigger publisher, but he always stayed with kind of independence, right, where he published his poetry and books.
Yeah, well, he had this really wonderful experience in middle age where he was this guy who was just a postal clerk who wrote poems, and he had his little column in the LA Free Press, which was a very pretty obscure publication in the big picture. But he had a fan called John Martin. Now, John Martin was a publisher, a successful businessman, a Christian Scientist who didn't drink or smoke, but he loved Bukowski's work, despite Bukowski being a drunk. And Bukowski also wrote, by the way, for pornographic magazines like Fling and Hustler and magazines like that. John Martin came to see Bukowski, and he said, "Look, I love your work. I'm going to give you enough money to live on if you leave the post office and write full time and let me publish all your work." And they kind of struck a deal, a handshake deal. And I think it started with $100 a month or $100 a week or something. It's in the book. In exchange for which Bukowski leaves the post office. He was going to get fired anyway, actually, but it was serendipitous timing. And he writes the books which John publishes for a wonderful small Californian imprint called Black Sparrow Press. And together they kind of built Black Sparrow Press into a big company or successful company, and Bukowski became world famous. And he was published all over the world.
Right.
Germany, France, and he was invited to appear on French TV and German television. He became an international celebrity.
Yeah, I was surprised. So in his home country where he was born, he was really, and still is famous, and still is really a cultural figure, certainly in the U.S. What's it like from the U.K.? How's Bukowski considered, or maybe from the continent?
Well, I think he had a peak of popularity in the 70s and 80s. Now, last year would have been his centenary year, and I don't think it didn't get much attention. I think his day maybe has passed slightly. He's not as popular now as he was 20 years ago when I wrote the book, and he was probably even more famous 20 years before that. And he was at one point very famous in Europe, especially in continental Europe. In Germany particularly, but also in Spain, in Italy, places all over continental Europe. But I think possibly his name has slightly faded a little bit since then.
Interesting, because I didn't know that he had that much of an international acclaim. But here in the States, definitely the culture, he will probably be always this kind of the great underground drunken writer. I don't know if there's anybody who stands with Bukowski in that thing. But also Bukowski you said he mixed with a lot of kind of famous people once he became famous at 50. I found it was interesting that he was eventually married by Manly Palmer Hall, like kind of a famous, really one of the famous occultists or Masons out there. That was curious. Can you talk about that?
Well, you've told me something I didn't know. He was married by who?
Manly Palmer Hall. Manly Palmer. He was like he was like a big occultist out here who had this place called, I can't remember, that Spiritual Science. It was up in Los Feliz, but it was an interesting connection. Do you talk about Robert Crumb and Bukowski?
Yeah. Robert Crumb, the great artist, he became a friend of Bukowski's, and he illustrated some of Bukowski's work very successfully. And I interviewed Crumb, who he gave me some artwork which I stupidly didn't keep, and I regret. I was thinking about it only today that I wish I'd kept it. My goodness me, because it was one beautiful stuff and valuable. But anyway, Crumb and Bukowski had a nice little partnership going, And Crumb really admired Bukowski's personality. The thing about Bukowski is if you like him as a writer, you also admire him as a man. He had a great deal of integrity. He wasn't somebody who joined the mainstream. He wasn't somebody who bought into the American dream, as it were. He was cynical. He was skeptical. He was himself. He lived on his own terms, and was successful on his own terms. He never pandered to the mainstream. He didn't want to be famous, but he became famous. He never wrote books that were, as it were, for popular consumption.
Right.
But in fact, he became a successful writer. And Crumb, who's of the same kind of mindset, really admired that in him, as did people like Sean Penn and Bono and many other one of the joys of writing a book was that it was very easy to interview people who liked Bukowski because they really loved him and they wanted to talk about him, and that included many famous people, Allen Ginsberg and Sean Penn and Robert Crumb and people like that. They were very willing to talk about Bukowski because they were very proud of the association they had with him, and they wanted people to know about what a great guy he was.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, you really kind of had that kind of an integrity that they, like you said, like they all admired. I mean, he also didn't he have a lot of stuff. He became even more famous after he died in '94. There was a lot of unpublished kind of poems and things like that too, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about Bukowski was that he was incredibly prolific. So apart from the 6 novels, which is where I would recommend anyone start, I would start with Post Office and Women. There's also several volumes of short stories, most famously a book called Notes of a Dirty Old Man. But then there are probably thousands of poems. And in his lifetime, he probably published 30 volumes of poetry. And some of these volumes are quite slim, as you would expect. There's a brilliant one called It Takes, The Days Run Away Like Wild Horses Over the Hills. It's quite a slim book. But some of them are really big, fat volumes, like 200, 300 pages long. And then after he died, John Martin, this publisher friend of his, who became his best friend, really, and they were business partners and friends. And John was the best man at Bukowski's second wedding. Bukowski married twice. And there's a widow, Linda Lee Bukowski, still alive. John, who, when I went to see John in Santa Rosa, writing the book, he had filing cabinets full of unpublished Bukowski material. He was showing me. He pulled out these filing cabinets. They were just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of stuff that Bukowski had sent him, which he hadn't published yet. And in the years after Bukowski died in '94, John published quite a few books of unpublished material, and that became a little bit controversial because some of Bukowski's fans thought that there was a bit of scraping of the barrel actually latterly.
Interesting. So they thought it was they should have left that stuff unpublished.
Yes, I think some people felt that, and I must say to some extent I feel that as well, because I think it's not all of the same quality, to be truthful. And I think also there's been some criticism of John for possibly editing some of the stuff. I mean, he was his editor. I mean, that was part of his role. He was his publisher and editor and friend and executor and, best man and, everything, he was the guy who bailed him out of jail. I mean, he was everything to Bukowski. But I think some people felt that John published too much. But I mean, in the bigger picture, John Martin was the best friend Bukowski ever had. And if it wasn't for John Martin, we would never have heard of Bukowski probably.
Interesting. And you also include one of his poems in your title, right? That's taken from a Bukowski poem, correct?
Yeah. So when I came to write the book, I was thinking, what do I want to call it? And I didn't want to give it a boring... if you love Bukowski, his poems really speak to you. And so there's a poem called One for the Shoeshine Man. And there's a line in it which says, "If you see me grinning from my blue Volks," which is his Volkswagen, he had an old blue VW Beetle, "running a yellow light, driving straight into the sun, I would be locked in the arms of a crazy life." which kind of sums him up in a sense, because his life was chaotic and in some ways extreme and sometimes very unhappy, but it was also full of moments of wonder and joy and success and love. And as I say, he was an intellectual, so he thought deeply about life, and he thought about the beauty in life as well as the bad side of life.
Right, like you see that mix of greediness and still that kind of wisdom or wizened old kind of writer in him, I think, in his work. I've read some of his works, but not all of them. I mean, what do you think that his legacy will be, and what do you think? I mean, you mentioned his 2 books that you suggest reading. What's the kind of best way, do you think, to approach Bukowski?
Well, I would start with the novels, because they're the most accessible, and of course, there's a story there, and it's the story of his life. So if you read Post Office, you're reading about Bukowski working in the post office, and he calls himself Chinaski. That's his fictional alter ego, Henry Chinaski. And then you'll find that this character Chinaski, Chinaski, appears in most of his books. So there's a book called Factotum, which is about when Bukowski was living in Philadelphia mostly, and living in a rooming house and having kind of terrible jobs, and drinking himself into a stupor every night. And so Chinaski is the hero of Factotum. And then there's a book called Ham on Rye, which is about Bukowski's unhappy childhood. And again, it's Henry Chinaski. And you learn to sort of, you get to know this character Chinaski, who's he's a drunk, and he's a loner, but he's got a sort of wry sense of humor, and he's a cynic. He's very cynical about society, but he's also and he's looking for love. He's always looking for love. So he's a romantic at heart, but he's often disappointed, and so he drinks a lot. And he hates his work, but he's a man who loves classical music, he loves literature, and he loves poetry. So he's a very complicated guy. And I think if you like Bukowski, you get to love this character Chinaski, and you really he becomes your friend, and you want to read all about his adventures. And if you get into it, you can like me, I've got probably 40, 50 books in the next room on the shelves, because there's plenty of it. There's so much of it, you probably can't even read all of it.
Right. I mean, it's really a remarkable amount. And I think most people who know Bukowski don't know how much he really produced. They just see him as maybe some of these novels or Notes of a Dirty Old Man, but they don't know about the poetry and some of the other nonfiction works. So I was surprised reading through about how really productive he was. He really was incredibly, considering he also was drinking a lot his whole life, right? I mean, his relationship with alcohol is a central component of his character. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so his widow, Linda Lee, would say that he wasn't an alcoholic, but I mean, of course he was. And it's absolutely plain that he was. And he was the sort of guy who would, the first thing in the morning, he would go to the liquor store on Sunset Boulevard, and he would just buy cheap wine, and he would, and after work he would just drink until he fell asleep, and he would wake up with a hangover, or sometimes he woke up, didn't know where the hell he was. He'd wake up on somebody's lawn somewhere in East LA, and there were nights in jail because of it, and there were suicide attempts. I mean, for years he lived, he said, with a noose under his bed. He made a noose, kept it under his bed, so it was handy for when he decided to hang himself. And so for much of his life, he was very, very depressed and unhappy. But then he had, one of the wonderful things about Bukowski is that his life has a happy ending, because after all these years of loneliness and poverty and kind of misery, really, but kind of smiling in the face of misery at the same time, he becomes a success.
Right.
He becomes a success. He makes a lot of money. He buys a nice suburban house down in San Pedro, just outside of LA. He buys a BMW for cash. He goes to the racetrack every day because he developed a love for horse racing. So he would go to Hollywood Park or Del Mar or one of those big racetracks every single day. And then he would come home and drink with his wife, have dinner, play with his cats. He was a cat lover. And then he would go to his study and he would write until, 3 o'clock in the morning, fall asleep and do the same thing over again the next day.
Wow. Yeah. So it's probably an ideal life for a writer. And I think one of his apartments in that kind of Eastern Hollywood area has a memorial for Bukowski. So there's places in the bar that he used to go to. I think it's up on Western, is now a famous kind of haunt that people go to. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I researched the biography, this sort of thing wasn't as yet established. And in fact, I also wrote a book called I wrote 2 Bukowski books. The biography, which is Charles Bukowski, Locked in the Arms of a Crazy Life. But I also amassed hundreds and hundreds of photographs because I went to Germany where Bukowski was born. I met his German family, and lo and behold, they had a suitcase full of photographs, which I bought. And I made a picture book out of it. And also to illustrate the picture book, I kind of took photographs of all the bars he used to drink in, which were still standing sort of 25 years ago. And I published them in the book. So one of them is the Frolic Room on Sunset Boulevard, which was a rough old joint when I went there. But partly because of the book, it's become a famous place to go. It's become like the Bukowski bar. And he also used to eat when he was famous. He used to eat in the famous restaurant on Hollywood Boulevard called Musso and Frank, which I think is still there.
Still there, yep.
Yeah, and many famous writers have eaten there over the years. And he's as you say, his most famous apartment was a place on De Longpre Avenue, which is just off Western Avenue, and I think you'll find that there's a kind of a plaque to him.
Yes,
because that's where he lived when he was a postal clerk for years and years and years.
Yeah, so there's also there on the La Brea, there is a bar called Bukowski. So that exists. So his imprint on LA is significant, and his cultural imprint on music is all over the place. Red Hot Chili Peppers, a lot, even to the UK, a lot of people mention him or are inspired by him. So he really kind of made it through that dark tunnel of his life and really had a cultural impact, really a remarkable person.
Yeah. There's a bar in London, actually in Camden, called Barfly. And of course, the other thing to mention is the films. There have been many, many films, not just Barfly, which was quite a big picture in the 80s with Mickey Rourke as Bukowski and Faye Dunaway, no less, as the Jane Cooney Baker character. But there have been a lot of films, and there are still films in the works. James Franco has been working on a film for years now about Bukowski. There's a very good Matt Dillon film based on the book Factotum, which I'd recommend. There was a Ben Gazzara film. There's been quite a few movies. The most famous is Barfly, but Barfly isn't the best of them.
Right, but it's still kind of to all my friends, people still make that quote here in the States. They still kind of laugh at it. I'm trying to figure out the bar. It wasn't on Western, it was on Vermont. Do you know of a bar up there that he used to go to? Vermont and Los Feliz? Yeah,
probably. I mean, it's a while since I've kind of done that sort of walk, as it were. But he would go to a lot of different bars. One was called the 7Gs, which was downtown. The Frolic Room, as I say, was actually on Hollywood Boulevard. Not there was another one called. Well, there were so many of them, but these were the kind of bars where there's no windows on the street. It's just like a door, and you go in, and there's like guys in there who you think have just come out of prison.
Right, they're drinkers' bars. They're like serious bars. They're not family bars. Yeah.
So you kind of don't. They're not sort of places where you and I would probably choose to hang out. But that's where Bukowski would spend his life.
The King Eddie. Do you remember the King Eddie? Does that sound familiar?
They
claim to be a Bukowski bar. That's on 5th Street. So it's probably by the U.S. Post Office where he used to work. So they claim he drank there.
That's where he worked, yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, but there's a lot. I mean, it's really the impact may be subtle, but he has really dispersed his ideas all over the world. It's really remarkable. Where's the best place for people to get this book, Howard Sounes?
Well, you can buy. I mean, the biography Charles Bukowski, Locked in the Arms of a Crazy Life, has been in print now since 1998, and it's an e-book, a paperback. It's an audio book on Audible, and you can get it on Amazon, of course, easily. The dreaded Amazon, and yeah. I mean,
and you said in the pre-show more people listen to the book than, I mean, it seems like more people are buying the Audible, correct?
Well, audio book sales are on the up historically, and yeah, people buy the Audible version of Charles Bukowski, which is read by me actually, where I have to try and do the American accent, so that's not necessarily wholly successful, but I read it with a sense of love, because the thing I'm sure you understand that this really was a labor of love. I mean, rather like these other people I've mentioned, I really loved Bukowski. I developed a love for his work, and the book wasn't necessarily something that was going to make me lots of money, but it was a labor of love, and I really enjoyed doing it. And in fact, I've written, I think now 11 books. I think it's my best book because I lived it, for those 2 or 3 years. It was my whole world. And actually, I started to live like Bukowski. I started to sort of live this strange life, too much drinking, and I started to eat like Bukowski. Bukowski had very particular tastes in everything he did, and so I started to copy what he did subconsciously, because I was so into his life that I became like him, and I actually dated one of his girlfriends at one point.
Oh, interesting. So you have a connection there, and people can find more about you in your 11 books at your website, howardsounes.com, correct?
Yeah.
And that's HOWARDSOUNES.com. So people can check that out there. You can also go back and listen to our talk about the Fred and Rose West tapes from October 2019. You can just type that in. And again, the author's name is Howard Sounes, and the book title is Bukowski, Locked in the Arms of a Crazy Life, published 1998, new edition 2017. So, Howard Sounes, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, William.
All right, take care. Stay there.